Welcome to Lecture 3. In this lecture, we will discuss how vacancies occur on the Supreme Court in particular, and within the federal judiciary more generally. We'll cover the most common ways that vacancies have historically occurred, including death, retirement, and changes to the size of the court. In doing so, we'll discuss the strategic motivations of the political actors involved. We'll end with a discussion of other potential ways we could see vacancies in a judicial system, though none of which are especially expedient in the United States. The primary purpose of this lecture, of course, is to explain when and why vacancies occur on the court. In our quest to answer this question, we'll dissect the historical patterns by which justices have left the Supreme Court, and we'll consider whether or not it's possible for Congress or the President to force a justice to vacate her seat. In particular, we'll consider Congress's ability to change the size of the court and briefly revisit something we talked about last time, Congress's impeachment power. Even though it's only Congress's authority to change the size of the federal judiciary, President Roosevelt is famous for his plan to pack the Supreme Court with his political allies during the Great Depression. So I'd like you to consider why FDR's plan never came to fruition. Finally, we'll be digging into some social science. We'll be looking at both systematic evidence and qualitative or anecdotal evidence. Recall that systematic evidence, which is a term I'll use a lot this semester, means that we're looking at quantitative data, quantitative evidence, where we bring statistical tools to evaluate our data. Qualitative evidence, on the other hand, can take many forms, but is usually, for our purposes, case studies or anecdotal evidence. Before we get into the social science, it's good to make sure we have a solid footing about the descriptive characteristics that comprise the Supreme Court. So quite obviously, the justices are the most important players. There are 8 associate justices and 1 chief justice. But this is not determined by the Constitution. Instead, the structure of the court, this division into a single chief justice and a number of associate justices, is entirely up to Congress. Similarly, Congress has the responsibility to determine how many seats there are on the Supreme Court and all other federal courts. Because of this, the size of the court has changed over time. The Judiciary Act of 1789, which hopefully you remember from last time, set the number of justices at 6. This increased to 7 by 1807 to correspond with an increasing number of district and circuit courts, which is the reason it was bumped up to 9 in 1837. By 1863, there were up to 10 justices on the Supreme Court, and a few short years later, in 1866, we were down to 7. In 1866, Congress decided they wanted the court to return to its original size of 6, so they weren't going to fill the next vacated seat. But then, in 1869, the court changed its mind once more, and we've had 9 justices ever since. So that's what you ought to know. Know that there was fluctuation in the size of the court, anywhere from 6 to 10 for the first about 75 years of the court's existence. But since 1869, we've had only 9 justices sitting on the Supreme Court. The justices are supported by some really valuable individuals. Perhaps the most critical to the functioning of the practice of the Supreme Court are the Supreme Court law clerks. Each associate justice has 4 clerks, and the Chief Justice can have 1 additional clerk, so you can have 5 to help with administrative stuff, but neither former Chief Justice Rehnquist nor current Chief Justice Roberts opted to take that additional clerk, so we've had just 36 clerks working for the court for the last, since 1986, for the last 30 some odd years by now. In addition to the law clerks, the justices are assisted by 4 officers. The clerk of the court is not to be confused with the law clerks, and the clerk of the court is charged with overseeing the filings and maintaining of records. The marshal is like a bailiff, and he or she is in charge of the Supreme Court police and security and the like. The librarian is probably pretty self-explanatory. The Supreme Court has its own law library. The library oversees staffing of the library, helps the justices and the clerks with when they need to pull things from that library, and the reporter of decisions is responsible for editing and publishing court opinions. All right, so with those details established, let's dive in. Recall that Article 3, Section 1 of the Constitution states that federal judges shall hold their offices during good behavior and shall at stated times receive for their services a compensation which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office. This means that almost all federal judges are appointed for life. Because justices cannot lose their jobs unless they commit some egregious offense, most justices serve on the court for a very long time. Historically, almost a quarter of Supreme Court justices have served on the court for 25 years or more. Given that justices can serve as long as they want, provided that they're behaving appropriately, the story must begin with a vacancy. So where do vacancies come from? As we start answering that question, perhaps you've already taken a step back to think about why anyone, not just a Supreme Court justice, chooses to retire or leave their job. Well, maybe there are several factors that influence when our parents and grandparents choose to leave their jobs. I bet that most of the people we know consider their economic security in their decision to retire. The justices are no different. If you were paying close attention in the last lecture, you might remember the answer to this question. But what do you think? How much do justices make? Pause, answer the question. Once you've answered it, once you've made your guess, then push play again and we can continue. If you guessed or remembered that the justices make between $225,000 and $275,000, you'd be correct. The current associate justices make around $245,000, $250,000, and the Chief Justice makes about $10,000 a year more. The graph you're looking at charts the associate justice salary over time, standardized to $1997. So this means in $1997, the justices make the equivalent of $168,000 a year, which is drawn in the graph in red. You should notice that Congress has made a lot of changes to judicial salary. There was a pretty steady increase throughout the 19th century and more turbulence in the 20th century. Today's justices are not making as much money, relatively speaking, once we adjust for inflation as they once were. And again, justices could make much more money if they took outside offers from law firms. Working in some of the big firms in New York City, for example, partners in those firms make a minimum of $2 million a year. So even though this $245,000, $250,000 is nothing to laugh at, it's not as lucrative as other jobs that justice might choose to pursue. And so when they're considering whether or not to retire, whether or not they have economic security for the rest of their life is probably a driving factor, just like it is for anyone else. So the Constitution gives us some parameters about how judicial salary operates. First, it tells us that judicial salary cannot be reduced for federal judges and Supreme Court justices, but Congress can, and certainly has, elect not to give judges and justices raises. The Ethics in Government Act of 1978 prohibits federal judges from receiving honoraria and other major sources of income. So federal judges and Supreme Court justices are really dependent on the salary and the pension plans that are set by Congress. So let's briefly highlight some important developments in judicial pensions. Before 1869, there was no such thing as a retirement plan for federal judges and justices. Judicial pensions were first established in 1869, and so for the very first time, federal judges had the opportunity to retire with a pension set at the final salary they earned, provided that they were at least 70 years old and had served in the federal judiciary for at least 10 years. Then in 1919, Congress created something called senior judge status. This created a new opportunity for federal judges. When a judge became eligible for retirement, he or she could either retire or go into semi-retirement, where the judge would still hear cases, but on a significantly reduced basis. Senior judges also qualify for subsequent pay raises for active judges. So there's an incentive to take this semi-retirement phase so that you continue to get raises if Congress approves them. When a judge decides to go into full retirement, his or her pension becomes locked in at the final pay level, and it's not indexed for inflation over time. After nearly a century under the 1869 plan, in 1954, Congress changed the pension eligibility requirements again. Now, retirement eligibility includes judges who are 65 years of age, not just 70, or those with more than 15 years of judicial service. 1984 saw yet another revision to judicial pensions, this time through the creation of something called the Rule of 80. This says that the sum of a judge or justice's age and the years of service must equal 80, with a minimum age of 65 and a minimum number of years of service equal to 10. So, for example, a judge with 10 years of service could not retire until he or she is 70 years old, while a 67-year-old judge could retire provided he or she had served for 13 years. A 65-year-old judge could retire if and only if he or she has worked on the court for 15 years. You should pause now to make sure you understand how the Rule of 80 works, since that is still the policy in place today. Let's say the judge has worked on the court for the federal judiciary for 15 years. How old must he or she be to retire? If you said 65 years, you'd be correct. Put differently, if a justice is 73 and wants to retire, what is the minimum number of years he or she would have had to have served in the federal courts in order to step down? I hope you did quick mental math here to come up with 7 years. A justice's decision to retire is certainly related to his or her pension eligibility. While we see no turnover or no new vacancies created the year before a federal judge is eligible for retirement, there's a sharp jump in turnover the year he or she becomes eligible to draw his or her pension. To look at the impact of economic considerations differently, let's look at some historical trends. Historically, the two most common ways vacancies have been created is through voluntary retirement or death, though the prevalence of each has varied over time. In the 19th century and well into the start of the 20th century, it was common for justices to serve on the Supreme Court until they died. The red dots that you see on the graph here represent vacancies created on the court when a justice passed away while in office. Notice that the x-axis denotes the date that the justice began serving in office, and the y-axis indicates the total number of years that a justice served before he or she vacated her seat. Remember, the Constitution says that a justice's pay cannot be diminished so long as they continue to serve in office. Certainly, some justices took full advantage of this provision and served until they literally could serve no longer. Importantly, you should notice that this trend is pretty much obsolete by the 1940s. In fact, former Chief Justice Rehnquist's death in 2005 and Justice Scalia's death in 2016, while in office, and I don't have Justice Scalia on here because I didn't update the graph through the 2016 data, but the deaths in 2005 of Rehnquist and Scalia mark the first deaths on the Supreme Court in more than 50 years. While historically many justices died while they were still in office, others chose to retire. The blue dots on the graph represent vacancies created by retirement. Congress first established the Judicial Pension Plan in 1869, and you'll notice that while there were sporadic retirements before then, again, notably in the early years of the court's existence, when the court was sort of ill repute and people were leaving the courts to take other outside options, but then as the court began to get better, most people stayed on the court until death. And then we see this pretty clear demarcation that when judicial pensions were developed, we start to see the change in a trend where retirements happened more frequently and staying on the bench until death started to decrease. Finally, the green dots represent the justices who are still serving on the court. Again, with notable exception of Chief Justice Rehnquist and former Justice Scalia, most justices today choose to retire voluntarily. Because of the prestige the court has built over time, and because most justices simply love the work that they do, many are reluctant to leave the court, and the decision to retire is not taken lightly. So, we've established that the ability to draw a pension is one factor that influences when we might see vacancies on the court. But it certainly doesn't explain all of the variation that we observe. And as good social scientists, that's what we're trying to explain, right? We always want to explain when we see variation. So what else might motivate a justice to leave the Supreme Court. Political science research provides evidence that judges and justices consider the political context that will surround the nomination and confirmation of their successor in the event that they retire. In particular, justices are acutely aware that the sitting president is in control of nominating a new justice. Unsurprisingly, retiring justices would like to have a like-minded justice assume the seat that they vacated, and are therefore reluctant to retire if the president's policy preferences are not in line with their own. When discussing the motivations for retirement, former Chief Justice Rehnquist once noted that the consideration of a sitting president's policy preferences may not be, quote, 100% true, but are certainly true in more cases than not, I would think. This is ironic, of course, since Chief Justice Rehnquist died in 2005 while still sitting on the bench, but his point is well taken, right? That most of the time, justices sitting on the court are cognizant of the political climate and would prefer to retire when the sitting president is of their own political persuasion, so that the president is more likely to appoint someone who would carry on that justice's legacy, assuming that he or she is confirmed. The handwritten note on this slide comes from Justice Harry Blackmun. We'll talk a lot about Harry Blackmun this semester because his papers that are housed in the Library of Congress are probably the most interesting of all of the justices' papers. But Blackmun was appointed by President Nixon in 1970, and he became increasingly liberal throughout his tenure on the court. So even though he was appointed by a Republican president, by the time he left the court, he was one of the more liberal justices sitting on the court. The day after Bill Clinton, Democrat, defeated incumbent George H.W. Bush, the Supreme Court was in session, hearing oral arguments, and Blackmun wrote himself a note, wondering whether or not he ought to retire at once, or whether he should wait until the end of the term in June of 1993, or whether he should serve until the end of the term in 1994. In any case, Blackmun was really clear about his desire to retire while Clinton was president, to give President Clinton the opportunity to fill his seat. Ultimately, Justice Blackmun decided against immediate retirement and decided to leave the court on this last option at the end of the term in 1994. But he did make sure that he retired under Clinton's watch, securing a liberal replacement in Clinton's nomination of Justice Stephen Breyer, who is still sitting on the court today. Other anecdotal evidence abounds. For example, when Sandra Day O'Connor mistakenly thought that Al Gore had beat George W. Bush in the 2000 election, she was at an election party and reportedly she said, "Oh no, that's terrible," because she had wanted to retire under a Republican presidency. She, of course, did get her wish when the election was ultimately called in Bush's favor. She retired in 2006 and was replaced by Samuel Alito, though there are rampant rumors that O'Connor is not happy with Alito's decisions and regrets her decision to leave the court when she did. Other examples abound. Take FDR appointee Justice Douglas as another example. He once said, and I quote, "Even if I am only half alive, I can still cast a liberal vote." But he became ill, and he was forced to retire under President Ford, and he worried out loud that Ford would appoint, quote, "some bastard" to replace him. Ultimately, Ford nominated John Paul Stevens to replace Douglas, so Douglas's fears were a bit unfounded. Similarly, Thurgood Marshall displayed commitment to sticking it out until there was a president in office with whom he agreed. Marshall instructed his law clerks to, quote, "prop him up" and keep voting on his behalf if he were to die during the Republican Reagan administration. He, too, ultimately got too sick and had to retire under a Republican president, much to his chagrin, allowing the first President Bush to replace him with Clarence Thomas. There are other older examples as well. For instance, James Clark McReynolds, a raging anti-Semite, said of President FDR, "I'll never resign so long as that crippled son of a bitch is in the White House." But like Douglas and Marshall, health thwarted McReynolds' wish, and he retired, giving FDR the chance to nominate Justice Burns. Though political considerations are of substantial concern to retiring justices, as the cases of Justices Douglas, Marshall, and McReynolds illustrate, sometimes health concerns outweigh political strategies. Toward the end of his career, though he was definitely reluctant to retire, Harry Blackmun could not help but to notice his own declining health. In particular, he began to lose the stamina necessary to complete his duties as a Supreme Court justice. Blackmun kept meticulous notes and would often write about the case and about the court during oral arguments. His private papers are now stored at the Library of Congress, as I mentioned, and they provide a wealth of information to scholars. In his notes, we see evidence of Blackmun's old age. For example, during oral arguments in one case, Blackmun wrote, "Not an easy one. I begin to get sleepy." In yet another, upon noticing stray pen marks on the pad in front of him, Blackmun circled those and commented, "These marks are a result of my dozing. I hope it's not too noticeable." In a different case, Blackmun writes, "Ho hum, am I being noticed? Ho hum again." Clearly, he was concerned that his colleagues noticed that he was barely able to keep his eyes open during oral arguments. And he commented in yet another case, "I'm having such trouble with drowsiness. Have I avoided notice? I doubt it this time." Okay, so there are scads of anecdotal evidence that justices are attuned to the political context of their potential retirement. But what about systematic, quantitative evidence? A relatively recent study by Nelson and Ringsmith, published in American Politics Research in 2009, analyzes the 32 justices who have served on the court from 1947 through the end of 2004, when we have good, reliable data. And systematically analyzing the data, their analysis finds that older justices are more likely to retire. That means as age increases, that's why I have that little positive sign, as age increases, there's a statistically significant increase in the likelihood that a justice will retire. They also find that participation in opinion writing of any type decreases retirement risk. So this suggests that the more active that the justices are while they're still serving on the court, if their minds are sharp and they're continuing to write opinions at the same rate that they were before, the likelihood that they retire goes down regardless of how old they are. But shockingly, this quantitative, systematic study finds that ideological distance between the president and the justice has no statistically significant effect at all. So that's a little bit puzzling. We'll talk about that more in just a second. Nelson and Ringsmith find, on the contrary, that the ideological distance between the justice and the Senate median has a negative and statistically significant effect, which seems to indicate the justices are not just paying attention to the president, but they're also paying attention to the confirmation process in the Senate. So if the Senate is ideologically opposed to the sitting justice, the justice seems to be paying attention to that and is more reluctant to retire if their replacement would face a challenge in a hostile Senate. So this is sort of interesting, I think, in that we learn that maybe quantitative data is not always the gold standard. So as social scientists, we tend to put greater weight into things that we can study scientifically. But here we are finding that the systematic evidence might be a little bit inferior to the qualitative case study or anecdotal evidence. Justices Douglas, Marshall, McReynolds, and other justices like Bill Brennan all tried to stick it out on the Supreme Court to wait for a Democrat to assume the presidency, but none of them were able to make it due to health reasons. Thus, there appears to be no numerical relationship, no statistically significant relationship between their policy preferences and the preferences of the president under which they retired. However, we know that this wasn't for lack of effort on their part. While we'll focus a lot on the value of statistical analysis to explain variation in the American judiciary, this should be quite convincing that we need both quantitative and qualitative research. While most vacancies in the federal judiciary have historically resulted from death or increasingly from voluntary retirement, history also tells us that the number of seats within the federal judiciary, both on the Supreme Court and in the lower courts, has not been stable over time. Thus, sometimes vacancies occur within the federal judiciary simply because the number of seats has expanded. Mostly, these changes have not been controversial. But there is one very important and notable exception: President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's plan to pack the court with his political cronies. Before we talk about FDR's political scheme, let's put it into context. In the 1920s, the court receives a lot of criticism for taking consistently pro-business positions in their decisions. Once FDR becomes president after he's elected in 1932, there is immediate internal talk within the administration about modifying the court, though for the time, no real action is taken. Then, in February 1935, as the court was getting ready to decide some important cases regarding FDR's gold policy, there was more persistent talk about retribution if the court struck FDR's policy down. So you have to think about the intense political climate of the 1930s during FDR's presidency. We're in the midst of a Great Depression. The country is relying on FDR and his administration to work with Congress to come up with policies to pull us out of the Great Depression. And the court continues to take pro-business decisions, striking down overreach of legislation coming out of Congress and out of the administration. So there's this high-profile case in February 1935 where FDR has drafted a policy regulating gold in the country, and it looks like the court might strike it down. Ultimately, they don't. The policy barely survives. The Supreme Court, you can see, is a bit hostile still to FDR, and so the writing is on the wall. By May of that year, more FDR New Deal legislation is before the court. On May 27th, 1935, which is referred to as Black Monday, the Supreme Court struck down central parts of New Deal legislation and significantly limited FDR's power over independent regulatory commissions. FDR's administration immediately begins to draft some proposals in response to the court's decision. But there's not enough support or outrage in Congress for an amendment yet to fly. You have to remember, right, that FDR can talk all he wants about packing the court, but he would need congressional support to do this because under Article 3 of the Constitution, as we've looked at that language already, Congress has the sole authority for expanding or limiting the size of the federal judiciary. It's not something that the president can do unilaterally. So FDR begins drafting those proposals. Nothing takes hold yet. But then, on January 6, 1936, the court struck down the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which is what paid farmers not to farm so that the country could eliminate surpluses and raise the value of existing crops. This decision was widely criticized, and the court's public support plummets as FDR gains even more of a surge in popularity. But still, there's no real plan of retribution from the FDR administration to the Supreme Court. But within a year, all of that changes. That same year, in 1936, FDR wins re-election in an absolute landslide. It's one of the most lopsided, if not the most lopsided electoral college outcomes in the history of the United States. In the end, FDR received 523 electoral college votes, while his challenger, Alf Landon, only got 8. FDR received 61% of the total vote and won all states in the Union except for Maine and Vermont. The court wasn't an issue in the election, but FDR comes in to his second administrative term feeling pretty high on the horse, right? He knows that he's got power, that he's got public support. So soon after starting his second term, FDR announces his plan to reform the judiciary. He announces this plan on February 5, 1937. FDR framed his proposal in terms of case backlogs and needing additional help to resolve crises. In short, he wanted to expand the size of the court just to help it, or so he claimed. His plan involved increasing the number of federal judges, reassigning some judges, and most controversially, increasing the number of seats on the Supreme Court. Specifically, he suggested that for every justice, over the age of 70, with at least 10 years of experience, the president would get to appoint a new justice. Once the plan is introduced, it's clear that people can see through FDR's scheme, and the proposal becomes nothing short of a debacle. FDR is forced to argue that the current justices are just wrong-headed. So his goal here was to appoint at least 3 new justices to the Supreme Court, increasing the size of the Supreme Court to 12. He was losing decisions here in these 5-4 majorities, right? So 5 justices were siding against him, 4 justices were siding with him. So he thought if he added 3 more justices to the court, then he would have a 7-5 decision in his favor. But it's really clear that this is what he's trying to do. And so there's lots of outcry about FDR playing politics with the size of the Supreme Court. But it's unclear whether or not this proposal will take hold in Congress. And so there's something that we call the switch in time to save 9, where the Supreme Court actually started to change its own tune. So even though the political ploy never took hold, the Supreme Court started to uphold state and federal laws that were regulating the economy, effectively neutralizing the main argument that FDR proposed for packing the court. So the switch in time that saved 9 effectively killed FDR's proposal, and the number of seats on the Supreme Court was preserved, and we've had 9 justices on the Supreme Court since 1869. Well, it's certainly true that the court changed its tune and started upholding New Deal legislation. You should also note that everyone saw through FDR's plan and noticed that it was a political ploy. FDR wouldn't have been able to follow through with it anyway, right, since it's up to Congress to determine the number of seats in the federal judiciary. Now it's such a strong norm that while they still have the ability to change the size of the Supreme Court, I doubt we'll ever see the number of seats changed on the Supreme Court again, because it would result in such massive charges or cries of foul play. Yet while the number of seats on the highest court in the land haven't been tampered with since the 19th century, the same can't be said of the lower courts. Notably, however, these expansions have not been majorly contested, since increases were better able to serve the American public through the creation of additional district and circuit courts. The Judiciary Act of 1789, remember, initially created only 19 judgeships in the United States, consisting of 6 Supreme Court justices and 13 district court judges. By 2005, Congress had created another 834 judgeships, adding 3 Supreme Court seats, 652 district court judges, and 179 seats to the courts of appeals. These additions happened gradually over the course of the nation's history. In total, there have been 37 authorizations to increase the size of the circuit courts. Notably, 32 of those, or 87%, occurred during a period of unified government, when Congress and the White House were controlled by the same party, and that certainly makes sense, right? Because the president has the job of picking people to fill those seats, of nominating judges and justices, which is what we'll talk about next time. And so when the Senate is controlled by the same party as the president is more likely to get his appointees confirmed by the Senate, and the Senate is happy that they're filling the federal judiciary with their political allies. There are several other potential ways to create vacancies in the judiciary, though none of them are really feasible in the United States. First, you could create a vacancy by sacking incumbent judges. But since the Constitution mandates that judges are appointed for life, judges and justices cannot simply be fired. The only way to forcibly remove a justice from office is through impeachment for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. If you remember from the last lecture, only one Supreme Court justice has ever faced impeachment, Justice Samuel Chase in 1805. By participating in President John Adams' re-election campaign, Chase had quite explicitly involved himself in the political process, which made him susceptible to attack by political adversaries. From the start, though, the impeachment was purely political, and Chase was acquitted during trial, ultimately securing the future of an independent judiciary. In short, we as a nation decided that judges cannot be removed from office for only political reasons. Since then, there have been rumors of impeachment proceedings, and impeachment proceedings have been started against a couple of justices, Justice William O. Douglas and Abe Fortas. Fortas's impeachment threat centered around issues of financial impropriety. Douglas was threatened with impeachment on account of having been married 4 times. Obviously, neither of these threats were carried through, and it's not politically expedient to impeach a Supreme Court justice today. Thus, we can't create vacancies by firing incumbents, but since federal judges are unelected officials, we also can't boot them from their positions through the electoral process. Note that, unlike the federal system, some state courts hold judicial elections, and we'll talk briefly about that process in the next lecture. Another potential way to create a vacancy on the court would be to kill the incumbents. Though it turns out we don't actually do that here. In other countries, when regime change occurs and a judge has lifetime tenure, just start making threats and make them disappear. This has historically been especially prevalent in Latin America and in John Grisham novels. Finally, another potential way to create vacancies on the court is to have different standards for appointment. For example, we are one of the few countries that offers federal judges lifetime tenure. Of a sample of 65 countries in the world that have constitutional courts, only 5 of them offer such a luxury. Besides the United States, only Argentina, Brazil, and Luxembourg provide lifetime tenure to judges or justices. Others have mandatory retirement age, 70 is the most common, or term limits, where 1 9-year term is the most frequent, or a combination of the 2 systems. To review, historically vacancies within the federal judiciary have been a result of death, voluntary retirement, or expansions to the size and scope of the judicial branch. While there are other means to create vacancies on a court, none of them are especially applicable to the constitutional system in the United States. Throughout today's lecture, we have assessed the motivations for justices to step aside, and we've looked at some qualitative evidence that political considerations matter a lot, even though this isn't borne out in the statistical analyses. Take some time to work through the topic objectives to make sure you've got a grasp on the material. Thanks again for listening.